Ja, vielen Dank, Hamza, für das Teilen deiner Geschichte hier. Und jetzt würden wir einen Schritt zurück machen, beziehungsweise eben jetzt den Beitrag von Dr. Ilse van Liemt anhören, weil mir wurde gesagt, das Video funktioniert jetzt. Genau. Und Dr. Ilse van Liemt ist Associate Professor an der Universität Utrecht für Geografie und ist Expertin für Menschenschmuggel und hat sich in ihrer Dissertation zum Beispiel mit Schmuggel von MigrantInnen in die Niederlanden beschäftigt und wird uns jetzt aus einer wissenschaftlichen Perspektive quasi der ganzen emotional aufgeladenen Debatte diese mit Fakten unterfüttern. Genau, und deswegen jetzt Vorhang auf für Ilse, die zwar nicht live jetzt da sein kann, aber trotzdem uns ihre Infos geben wird. Viel Spaß.
We've all seen the horrible news of the shipwreck in Greece 2 weeks ago. Greek authorities have confirmed 78 deaths, but many bodies are still missing. The police believes around 500 people are lost at sea, and witnesses say that there were up to 100 children in the ship. This is not the first time an accident like this happens at our borders in Europe. Europe has the deadliest borders in the world. It's not Europe, but most of the time smugglers who are blamed for accidents at sea like this. After the recent Greek shipwreck, some of the survivors were arrested in full media attention, accused of being smugglers, and blamed for the tragedy. In my talk today, I want to argue that this is a distraction. Putting blame on smugglers takes away attention from Europe's own role in these tragedies. It legitimizes even stronger border controls, whereas it is exactly these policies that kill. It's Europe's constant refusal to create safe migration channels for people seeking asylum in its territory that are to blame. When writing and talking about human smuggling, it's often forgotten that smuggling arises from a mismatch between global migration intentions and opportunities for legal migration. For asylum seekers, it's most of the time impossible to cross borders legally. They cannot go to an embassy and ask for a visa. They also need smugglers to get out of their country in the first place. In this context, smugglers provide opportunities to asylum seekers to leave a country at war and find protection somewhere else. It's important to stress the link with migration opportunities. Hein de Haas, a Dutch migration scholar, for example, illustrated in his work that boat migration across the Mediterranean is only a 25-year-old phenomenon. It started when Spain and Italy introduced Schengen visa for North Africans in 1991. Before that time, circular migration between North Africa and Southern Europe was very common. Since the introduction of the visa, North Africans who no longer had access started to cross the Mediterranean in pateras, small fishing boats, with the use of smugglers. Empirical research in North Africa found that most of the Moroccan and Tunisian fishermen who now work in the smuggling industry are doing so only after they have lost their jobs in the fishing industry. And this is in part due to European legislation. And also because their governments sold their fish quotas to Spain and Italy. It's this wider, more global picture that needs to be addressed when smuggling is discussed. Today, it's no longer only North Africans, but migrants from other conflict-affected countries such as Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, or Sudan, who arrive at the borders of Europe with the help from smugglers. This shows that the patterns of migration to Europe are continuously changing, and it's different people who rely on smugglers for different reasons. In many parts of the world, migrant smugglers have become a necessary part of the migration journey. Restrictions to mobility are nothing really new, and assistance for migrants who are officially prohibited from migrating through legal channels is not new either. In the US, for example, bans on the slave trade after the Civil War triggered smuggling practices that lasted for decades. During the Second World War, Jews were smuggled out of Nazi Germany. These smugglers were later often praised for their heroic acts, for example in Hollywood films like Schindler's List. In your conference today, you will honor the work of Lisa Fittko, who in her book Escape Through the Pyrenees writes about the smuggling of Jews during the Second World War. Parts of guest worker migration to northern European countries in the 1960s also occurred outside the regulatory frameworks. And additionally, the smuggling from East to West Germany, across the wall, is also looked upon more hierarchically than current acts of smuggling. Now, why are these smuggling acts looked upon so differently? Part of the explanation is that refugees who had fled the communist regimes, for example, were identified as being anti-communist, as being more like us in the West. This attitude changed when migration started to occur from places increasingly with the West less identified, but also what we know less about. The social context of human smuggling is very similar today in the sense that migrants still respond to war situations, demands of labour markets, and state-initiated limitations on mobility. Smugglers are nowadays, however, perceived much more as criminals than before. It's important to realize that in the European context, there was no explicit policy around human smuggling until the summer of 2000, when the French presidency of the European Council drew up a legislative proposal for a framework decision on strengthening the penal framework for preventing the facilitation of unauthorized entry and residence. It's only since then that human smuggling is increasingly penalized and criminalized in Europe. Growing resources have also been devoted to combat the phenomenon of human smuggling since the 1990s. The immediate cause for this legal framework was a high-profile smuggling case that involved many European countries. On the 18th of June 2000, customs officials at the British port of Dover found the dead bodies of 58 Chinese nationals in the back of a lorry. The Chinese migrants had suffocated in a sealed container filled with tomatoes. Only 2 survived. Politicians all over Europe were eager to share their views on this incident, their outrage, and the Dover case played a crucial role in discussions around penalizing human smuggling in the EU context. So in 2000, the UN Protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, air, and sea came into being. And migrant smuggling was from then on officially included in the definition of organized crime. The UN Protocol, also referred to as the Palermo Protocol, is part of the UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, so it explicitly situates human smuggling in the context of organized crime. This is the framework we still work with today. Tragic boat accidents in the Mediterranean, like the one I referred to in the opening of this talk, are putting European politicians under pressure to do something. The most common reaction so far has been to fight against smuggling. We've seen increased maritime border patrolling over recent years, financial investments in European border control collaborations, and the use of innovative technologies to try to detect and imprison smugglers. The EU's reaction is mainly through increased border securitization. Increasing border controls, however, have not stopped asylum seekers and other migrants from crossing borders. At the contrary, they have made migrants even more dependent on smugglers. Further criminalizing and penalizing smuggling, rather than protecting migrants for whom smuggling is often the only option to find security, seems the way forward in EU's point of view. When the EU framework decision that penalizes smuggling was discussed in October 2000, the Brussels Bureau of the UNHCR intervened in the decision-making process by declaring that I quote, "It's regrettable that, as a result of states' increasingly restrictive immigration policies, resorting to the services of human smugglers has been the only viable option for many genuine asylum seekers who seek sanctuary in the European Union." The UNHCR back then called upon the EU to insert a general saving clause for the protection of smuggled refugees and asylum seekers into the draft framework decision. The definition of help in the Council directive does not specify doing so for financial gain, meaning that anyone helping migrants to cross a border could fall into the classification of human smuggling, regardless of their motivations. Now, what followed were discussions around exactly the definition of human smuggling and who should count as a smuggler. It turned out that the European Council's delegation all had very different views on what constitutes humanitarian grounds for smuggling. Not all states agreed with the interpretation of help. Back then, the Austrian, Danish, Dutch, Finnish, and Swedish delegation decided to leave financial gain in their national definition of human smuggling in order not to affect work done by humanitarian organizations for refugees. Today, in most European countries, the profit-making element has, however, been removed, which means that smuggling for humanitarian reasons is punishable in almost all European countries. All over Europe, we see that those who advocate for migrants often find themselves subject to criminalization. Civil society in Europe has increasingly become involved in helping refugees arrive safely in order to find protection. But this sometimes involves being accused of smuggling. Large organizations like Save the Children and Médecins Sans Frontières have even been accused of smuggling with their rescue operations. Now, contrary to the portrayal of human smuggling as a distinct form of organized crime, most academic research indicates that the market for human smuggling services is hardly ever dominated by overarching mafia-like criminal structures that have monopolized all smuggling activities from the source to the destination country. In most regions of the world, there exists a very complex market for highly differentiated smuggling services offered by a multitude of providers that potential migrants can choose from. Guiding, transporting someone across a land or sea border, providing forged documents, offering shelter, bribing officials is all part of the smuggling industry and is often offered by different people who are responsible for parts of the process. There are only few smuggling cases where organized crime is proven to be involved from the beginning to the end. Although there are indicators that the smuggling industry is becoming more expensive and more violent, especially at the fringes of Europe. At the fringes of Europe, opportunities to make profits arise for smugglers now that so many migrants are waiting in transit and desperately want to make the final crossing. Libya is a very good example, where many smugglers profit from the situation that makes it impossible for migrants to migrate or to continue their migration on their own. In my work, I explain, based on interviews with smuggled migrants, that the relationship between the smuggler and the smuggled migrants becomes more anonymous the closer to Europe one gets. This increases the likelihood of being exploited. Close to home, smugglers more often depend on stories of their success to keep the business going, and there are reciprocal relations that in a way guarantee safe migration. I remember an interview I once did with a smuggler who was in despair because one of the people he smuggled across the border did not make it, actually drowned in a river at the border between Turkey and Greece. He was in this total despair because he knew he had to go and tell the family that their son had not made it. When the embeddedness of smuggling within communities is taken into account, a whole different perspective arises. Now, discursive associations between smugglers and crime are continually made, most of all to justify the need for combating human smuggling. Very little attention, however, is paid to the societal context in which human smuggling takes place. Smugglers are often seen as those who have created migration possibilities for immigrants whom receiving countries have classified as unwanted, as illegal. Now, in this logic, smugglers' activities undermine the nation-state's power, and they've become the literal embodiment of a failing border regime. Something that strikes me in the public discourse as well is that often a direct link is made between paying a lot of money to smugglers and not being a genuine or deserving refugee. Asylum seekers who arrive spontaneously are perceived unlikely to be legitimate refugees because they had to enlist the help of costly human smugglers. It's often assumed that people who can afford to pay large amounts of money are not eligible for refugee protection. By emphasizing the amount of money people pay, the perception that wealthy refugees are not real refugees is reinforced. One's level of financial welfare, however, does not say anything about one's need for refugee protection, just as the way someone who's entered a country does not define them as a real or a bogus asylum seeker. Now, if we look at what the process of blaming the smuggler means for migrants involved, there are a couple of issues at stake. First of all, there has been a remarkable shift in asylum interviews in Europe from reasons to flight to how and where people have crossed the border. In recent years, the public dialogue has shifted from the criminal regimes asylum seekers escape to the criminals who assisted them in their escape. Eligibility screening interviews at ports of entry are becoming longer and more detailed, and a lot of emphasis is put on what migrants know about their smuggler. Smuggled migrants, in a way, are increasingly used as information sources for purposes of intelligence gathering data. These policies of blaming smugglers divert attention away from the fact that smuggling is first of all a reaction to the militarization of border controls. It's not the cause of irregular migration. Certainly, smugglers can be ruthless and regularly deceive migrants, but it should not be forgotten that smugglers deliver a service asylum seekers and migrants are paying for. And without smugglers, it's likely that many more people would have died crossing borders. In my work, I describe smuggling as a necessary evil in a context of restricted mobilities. By focusing only on who provides border crossing, the question why people need to cross borders is overlooked. Blaming the smugglers takes attention away from the root causes and could potentially lead to thousands of people being trapped in war zones without any means of escaping conflict and serious human rights violations. Policies aimed at controlling human smuggling are often based on inadequate understanding of migrants' motivations and the mechanisms underlying human smuggling. For some, smuggling can be the only means to enjoy fundamental rights, to live in union with one's family, and to escape violence. By investing even more money in border control and by creating more fences, the EU is, ironically enough, creating a space for the smuggling business to flourish, to expand, to professionalize. Border control has become a huge industry, an industry that makes the public believe that we are confronted with a crisis that is not solved in ways other than fighting smugglers. Migrants are not helped with this rhetoric. As long as violent conflicts persist in countries like Syria or Sudan, people will keep coming in one way or another. National politicians who argue that border controls can stop that are selling illusions. Policies that effectively aim at reducing human smuggling must be comprehensive, consistent, and they have to be embedded in wider common EU immigration policy that recognizes and addresses root causes of migration. Now, when designing such policies, upholding human rights and protecting the safety and lives of migrants must be pivotal. Thank you.
Grenzübertritt moralisch und rechtlich als legitim oder eben nicht bewertet wird, hat sich auch, wie ganz am Anfang im Kampagnenvideo gezeigt, wird sehr unterschiedlich bewertet, je nachdem, in was für einem politischen Kontext und zu was für einer Zeit wir gerade sind. Deswegen wollen wir mit euch ein paar Geschichten aus der Geschichte teilen, aber auch zur ganz aktuellen Situation, die schon angesprochen wurde an der polnisch-belarussischen Grenze. Julia, ich gebe an dich weiter.
Genau, und deswegen würden wir gerne als nächstes Kalina auf die Bühne bitten. And I will switch to English now, so you can understand me. Yeah, this is Kalina Schwarnok, who works for the organization Ocelenie, if I pronounce it correctly. And yeah, Kalina can speak about a very current example of how some help to cross a border is being treated in a certain way, while the other help at the very same border is treated in a different way. And yes, your organization works both at the Belarusian and at the Ukrainian border. And maybe you can start and first tell us what you do at the borders and what your activities are.
Thank you. And hello everyone. So we've been working on the border between Poland and Belarus since almost 2 years, since summer 2021. I don't know if you can hear me good. Yes. And we've been providing humanitarian help, basically, for people who want to move, who cross into Poland. We meet adult men, women and children in the woods, in the swamps, in the fields, and we provide them with really basic things like food, water, clothes, shoes, but sometimes we also have to provide medical help and some legal, but the last one isn't very common because most of the people who cross already know that it's not a good choice to ask for asylum in Poland, so they stopped trying after they discovered how cruel Poland is to them. And of course, we have to do it very secretly. We have to hide from the police, from the border guards, because every meeting with any kind of Polish forces can end up very badly for people on the move, but also for the activists. We already had some colleagues who were arrested and stayed the night in jail. We have colleagues who've been accused of being smugglers. I have colleagues who have been kept at the gunpoint with the long guns, with some 15 soldiers around. The soldiers never give us their names, they never show their faces, they never answer any kind of questions, but they have the guns and sometimes they even unblock them, so we don't have much to say.
And can you also tell us, because the reality you described now, this is at the Belarusian border, as I understand, and how was the experience when then the attack in Ukraine happened and people came from the Ukrainian border, and as I understood you also went there and helped the people, like how were the differences?
Yeah, so on 24th of February last year, until 11 a.m. I got like maybe 94 unanswered calls on my phone. So we very quickly went to the Ukrainian border to do an assessment and to check what are the most urgent needs, and it was so weird. People were smiling, welcoming us, and they treated us as heroes, while, 200 kilometers up north, we were called traitors and enemies and Putin's spies. So you can be both hero and a traitor at the same time. You just have to move along the border.
And also, as I understood, your activities were mostly the same at both borders, and
No, because you can transport a person that crossed the Ukrainian border into the country, but you can't do it to the person that crossed Belarusian one, so no.
And maybe you can also tell us a bit more, like the accusation of smuggling at the Belarusian border. As I understood, it's also not just about actually helping people to cross, but it also affects many more activities that you can't do.
Yes, so even if you would like to help person to get to a hospital, and this person will be found in your car, you can be accused of smuggling. If the person was found in Poland, but in a very, let's say, dangerous place, like in the swamps, and you help the person to move to a safer location, but still inside Poland, not crossing any other border, you still can be accused of smuggling. And even giving any tips to people, like go this way, go that way, that also can end up with an accusation. So all we can do really is to give people stuff, to maybe, you know, give them some medical help, and that's all, unfortunately.
And maybe also, I guess it's important to note that the situation is still not over, it's still ongoing, right? Maybe you want to say some words about the current situation?
Yes, so unfortunately the situation didn't really change. The only change is that we have a wall, but people still cross, and I don't know if you heard about it, but right now we have almost as many people crossing into Poland from Belarus that we had in 2021. It's just not visible in the media, we just don't talk about it. And people are still being brutally tortured on both sides of the border. Last month I've heard about a man who was electrocuted, then put into water, and then electrocuted again by Belarusian soldiers, because they force people to cross with torture, with the beating, so they will cross and cross again. That's their goal. So people who cross into Poland, they have no other choice. They just have to go.
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing the insights at the Polish border. Yeah, as you could hear, this is a very important example of today, where you can see how facilitating border crossings of people can be treated and also looked at in a very different way depending on where the people come from and what the political objective behind it is. And we are very grateful that there are people like you and organizations like you and people that don't make this differentiation and try their best.
Thank
A
you.
warm applause for coming.
Vielen Dank auch von mir für diesen tollen Beitrag.